Thanks all for coming. Thank you to Dawn for inviting me, and it's kind of fun to be back in this classroom. It's really nice to be back here, actually. So I'm honored. I'll be talking about a biography, working on a biography, how it's like putting together a puzzle. And in my case, the puzzle had 600 citations, if you can imagine. As I go through more of the slides, I'll talk about the resources I used. I'll read excerpts to show how I weave those resources together. And then towards the end, I will talk about the archives I used. This first slide I'm just using sort of as an introduction to give you an overview of his life, just so you can become a bit more familiar with what he did during his lifetime. He really did a lot of things. He worked for the Writers' Project, of course, which was the book title. They focused on that. He was a foreign correspondent for The Nation, and he was a freelance writer. He wrote for a lot. He wrote for The Masses and other leftist, radical kinds of publications. He was, and strangely enough, he was an advisor to government officials. And I'm like, didn't they know he wrote for The Masses? It was kind of weird. But he was an advisor to two ambassadors to Turkey, Henry Morgenthau and Abram Elkis. And he also advised Secretary of State Robert Lansing at the time about World War I. So it was really strange. He was a diplomat in Turkey, and he worked there. And then during most of the 20s, he worked both in New York and in Eastern Europe and Russia for a group called the JDC, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, working to save refugees and survivors of pogroms. And at one point, he was arrested when he was hanging out with his good friend Emma Goldman. He was arrested by the Cheka. It was the Soviet secret police. So that's just a really quick overview. Well, wait, I actually have more stuff to tell you. So this is a little abridged excerpt from the book's introduction. More than a century after he graduated from Columbia University, more than 80 years since he worked as a foreign correspondent and volunteer for Jewish refugees in Europe, and more than 70 years since the House Committee on Un-American Activities, that's UAC, eviscerated his career with Roosevelt's New Deal, and more than 4 decades since he died an old, largely unremembered man, I met and fell in love with Henry Alsberg. Like other love affairs, ours began serendipitously. I was at the New York Public Library researching the Federal Writers' Project, one of Franklin Roosevelt's WPA arts programs, and I kept tripping over Alsberg's shadow. From 1935 through 1939, he was national director of the Writers' Project, so of course I was going to run into him. I was already fascinated with the project, as some of you may know, and Henry Alsberg, its guiding star, he hovered around me like a ghost, and he's sitting, like I said, in the back. The New Deal jobs program existed for only a few years, but it left a legacy that still reverberates today. My original search was for Writers' Project documents, but I soon discovered that Henry Alsberg was peeking around every other research corner, whispering, luring me over to tell me about his other work too. So in some of these bullet points you see what some of his other work is. And there's even more of his other work. Whoops, went the wrong way, sorry. Can't see. So more bullet points. He did theater in the 1920s in New York City Downtown Theater, Provincetown Playhouse. He translated and adapted a Yiddish play called The Dybbuk, where the wall between reality and the supernatural disappears, where the soul of a dead person lives on. That's sort of important to note that that's kind of involved in that. He initiated the first International Political Prisoners Aid Group. That was before Amnesty International. He was a friend of all of these liberal intellectuals, and this is his JDC ID. That's Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. They were both radicals who were deported radicals. I don't know if they were radicals, considered radicals, deported from the U.S. To Russia. And that's Richard Wright, who was one of the Writers' Project writers. This is a short reading. Takes place in about 1919. It's right after World War I. He was traveling as a reporter through Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and the Balkans. And he was in his late 30s, and it kind of describes his character a little bit. Alsberg's writings often veered from politics into human rights. He wrote about Jewish inhabitants and their struggles in these articles, but he felt just as strongly about other subjugated minority populations. The Great War and its aftermath had stirred his pacifist tendencies. A few years later, his sympathies for all oppressed peoples were highlighted in an article about the Dybbuk, the mystical melodrama he translated when he wrote, "What really counts," this is a quote, is the universal brotherhood of all right-thinking and doing persons," unquote. Journeying from Serbia to Bulgaria, he struggled to understand how people on either side of the border, despite their similar clothes and language and landscape, were, quote, brought up to hate each other unto death, unquote. Veering once more into the themes of human rights and equality, or the lack thereof, he noted that the poor peasant who inherited, quote, the wrong dialect from his improvident parents, there are right nationalities and wrong nationalities, and the man whose nationality chose wrongly now has to suffer. Make sure I go in the right direction. Okay, so of course you have to find the right tools to do the research. I call it scholarly stalking, so it's like, you're stalking somebody, they're dead, so it's, not so bad. I used a lot of genealogical records. I have some of them listed here. When I was doing it, I kind of course, started looking into my own family. Hey, let me look up this relative. So these are it's very pixelated. It was from an old newspaper, 1917. These are my, I come from circus people, basically. They were a vaudeville troupe, and they were also circus people. So the middle guy over there is my great-grandfather. I'm pretty sure that's my grandmother and my great-aunt. They were all in the troupe at various times. He led it, and he was a scoundrel. But so that was from 1917. But when I found that photo, I also found in that newspaper of 1917, I found the news of the day. Suffragettes were on the front page. The rest of the day's paper, you could see who was playing in the theater, how much socks cost, all of those things that would be interesting, at least to me, or to anybody who's interested in history or anything. And it's important to understand the era in which the subject lived, the social, the political, the cultural forces. So reading the newspapers of the day was really very helpful. Before I started the research, I actually didn't really know that. I had general knowledge about, World War I, about the Russian Revolution, about the U.S. in the 20s, but there was really a lot I didn't know, and I thought I should get a PhD or something from the research I did. One of the things I had to really study up on, and actually one of our databases helped, the borders of Europe after World War I were constantly changing. I mean, like by, monthly, weekly, daily sometimes. A town could be in Poland one day and in Russia the next day. So I had maps from different years. So, okay, he's here in 1919, he's in this town. Okay, then it was in Romania. So I had to kind of keep checking to see where he actually was, and just to get a handle on the information I needed. And it made sense. My grandmother, who was from a town in Eastern Europe, sometimes she'd say, well, I was from Poland. And then other times she said, well, I'm from Russia. I'm like, well, where are you from? Why don't you know? And I kind of understood after I started doing this. Did I have a reading for that? No. Okay. So it's important to cross-reference to make sure you're finding the right person if you're doing genealogy kinds of things. There were probably 2 or 3 other people with his name. So I would always, this is a ship manifest. This is a little section from a ship manifest. So when he was coming back from like wherever, he went to Europe a whole bunch of times during the 20s. And then of course he came back. So I checked his birth date. It was the right person. I also checked to make sure that it had his address, to make sure it was the right person. And I looked at a lot of ship manifests because he did so much traveling during the 1920s. I used free genealogical sources as much as I could, but there is also Ancestry, and there's another one called Fold 3, which you either have to pay for, but really you don't, because the public library has them. So it's you can save yourself some money, basically. Is there anything else I wanted to tell you about that? Yeah, so that's a picture from his passport. Oh, I'll show you this. This is his class book. I'll show you that in a second. So, like a journalist, you have to ask the who, what, when, where, why, how of everything. I'm kind of going back a little bit to his early life. So it kind of looks like a hodgepodge of information on the screen, and it felt like that. I mean, I had piles. Anybody who's done research, you have piles and piles of stuff, and you kind of have to organize it and put it together. So some of the sources, and when I talk about the sources, it's always some, because whatever I list is just like maybe a quarter of what I use. But I'll try to give the most important ones. So some of the sources I used, his brother, thank goodness, was a famous scientist at the time. He was one of the heads of the, it wasn't called the FDA at the time, but it was the early days of the FDA before it was called that. And another friend was named Alfred Kroeber, who was a famous anthropologist. So their biographies, yeah, they were biographies, had a lot of stories about them growing up as kids. So that was useful. And the cool thing, Alfred Kroeber, the anthropologist, his daughter is Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction writer. Yeah, and I was Ursula Le Guin. Yeah. So I had a nice little email exchange with her.
She's a New Yorker. But so who was she the daughter?
Alfred Kroeber, he was a famous anthropologist. He studied Native Americans. And she is she's his daughter. Yeah, and I was able to get her email address, and I emailed her a couple of times, and that was like, she didn't really help me, but it was fun to email her. I was like, oh, I have Ursula Le Guin on my email. So those biographies were helpful. Censuses were used. They told me where the family lived at the time of his birth, where they moved over his life, over his young life, who else lived in the buildings, like were they professionals, or because it would say what their occupations were in the census. Other things that told me where he lived, and that was helpful for various reasons, were his father's obituary. So his father, when he died, they lived at 169 East 116th Street. And another obituary, it was from a journal article, his father was a chemist, so it was in a chemical journal, talked about how the family was actually on vacation when he died. So that was sad. They were in the Adirondacks. Henry was 14. So, it was young. And that is a obit of his grandfather, who was also a doctor. That's his brother Carl. And the top picture, the tall woman in the middle, is his sister. She went to Barnard College, and this is in the 1890s. So his family was very into education for all. They were really a progressive family. So this is just, I had a lot to read about, New York City, in the 1890s. It's really cool stuff, how it changing from horse-drawn wagons to, trolleys and things like that. And there was a lot of open space, but there wouldn't be time to read it all. So this is just a little paragraph about being a child. As a child, Henry tagged along his brothers and other boys on outings with the wilds of New York City as their backyard. He almost giddily recalled those days many years later. We used to go on immense trips together, he said, usually up to the Bronx Zoo or to Van Cortlandt Park or along the aqueduct up to Westchester, or played hare and hounds in Central Park, unquote. I think that was hide and seek. Their boyhood wanderings included trips to the New Jersey marshlands, rural Staten Island, and parklands in the Bronx, quote, then largely open country, to collect beetles and butterflies. So I wish I could tell you more. Well, if you read the book, you'll see New York City was a different place. If your biographical subject went to college, and if you're lucky, they have a nice treasure trove like I was able to find at Columbia University. And I made two visits, I think. Second one with Victoria, who helped me with photography, thank you. And my rule of thumb for archives after all of this, if you think you need only one day there, double, triple, quadruple it. You don't need one day, you need way more than one day. So some of my resources for this chapter were, of course, the archives in person, where we were able to find that top photo. In the middle, the guy with the mustache is Henry in his junior year. This is from his class book. He was a cellist in the school orchestra. It was a new orchestra. It's kind of a famous orchestra in terms of colleges. Morningside was the literary journal that his brother started, and then he continued working on writing and editing when he was there. And then the Columbia Spectator was the newspaper. It still is. It's digitized. It's online. It goes back to 1877. So I was able to find out all sorts of things from the comfort of my home. About his college life. He played football. We had a hard time finding football photo. I knew he played football. He wasn't in the yearbook photos, but we did find one photo of him in a football uniform. So I don't think he played for very long. So thank you for Victoria. Sorry, I don't have to balance you. So I'm just going to read a couple of things about him from college. Just 14 years old when he sat for his entrance exams, and 2 weeks past his 15th birthday when his studies began in the fall, Alsberg was the youngest member of the class of 1900, self-named the Naughty Naughtians. Entrance required and this is interesting for all of us as teachers here, both intellectual agility and scholarly preparation. Students were expected to be proficient in either French or German. He was in both. Additionally, they had to be conversant with both Latin and Greek, with the ability to read prose and understand grammar, composition, and the rules of poetry in both languages, if you can imagine. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. His class autobiography, so that's a photo from it, and I'll pass it around. If you could just be very careful with it, because if you want to look at it. The students published it, so it was different from the yearbook. It was their class book. It's called The Naughty Naughtians. His class autobiography disclosed a whimsical, even facetious streak, mixed with a playful disregard for authority. Where others in the book proclaimed scholastic and athletic conquests and ambitious dreams for the future, Henry Garfield Alsberg somewhat proudly boasted about being late for classes on a regular basis. His middle name, Garfield, was after the president who died of assassination, the wounds from an assassination attempt a few days before Henry was born. So he was the only one in his family. They were from Germany. The parents were from Germany. So all of his brothers and his sister, they all had family German names, and he was the only one with this middle name that was purely American. Oops. So this slide relates to his time in Turkey as an assistant to Ambassador Elkis. The resources, some of them that I used for this section, were books about the ambassadors at the time, Henry Morgenthau and Abram Elkis. Henry's application to the State Department to work in the diplomatic corps. That was at the National Archives. So that was a letter from Ambassador Elkis to the Assistant Secretary of State, basically saying this is the guy he wanted as his assistant. When he got back, he saw horrendous things when he was there. He wasn't there for a long time, maybe a year, but he saw really terrible things, and he wrote about it in the New York Post, New York Evening Post. It's not the New York Post of today. It was the New York Evening Post, different, same, it kind of came from that, but it was a very liberal paper back then. So he wrote about his experiences in that paper and other publications. Okay, yeah, so that kind of refers to that one. It was hard to kind of decide what to put in to here because of so much, and he did so many different things. This is a paragraph from his time in Turkey. It was in Constantinople, with its view of fabled sunsets over the Golden Horn, that Alsberg learned the art of relief work. If not for war, political tyrants, massacres of Armenians, and poor conditions of the Jews and other civilians, it might have been a grand adventure. Constantinople's placement on the crossroads of continents made it an exotic mosaic of East and West. Alsberg was fascinated by the foreign Jewish culture. He could speak German and get by in Yiddish, but many of the Jews there spoke and sang in the unfamiliar tongue of Judeo-Spanish, also known as Ladino. They played Sephardic Turkish music using instruments such as the fretted balama. Their dishes featured eggplants and leeks. This seasoned German-American traveler was a long way from Schubert and sauerbraten. Oh, so this top photo is from the American Relief Administration. It was an American government organization run by Herbert Hoover. He wasn't president by then, but he directed it. And the ARA. The ARA worked with the JDC, sorry, so many acronyms, to help provide food to starving civilians in Eastern Europe and Russia at the time. So that's a picture from the ARA, and that's children waiting for food. That's, again, one of his ID pictures from the JDC. This is one of his articles from The Nation. And the reason I picked this one is because he wrote many, many, many articles for The Nation. This one I saw where he wrote it, it was from the town my grandmother was from. So that's the one I chose to use because I'm like looking at that. And it was my grandmother was 5. They came to this country, I think in 1905 after pogroms to escape. And, he's writing about more of them, 15 years later. And basically, her family, it was good that they came because they were either killed in the pogroms of this period or the rest of them were wiped out, people who stayed during the Holocaust. But anyway, it's from Komenets Podolsky. They spelled many different spellings. So a lot of the first half of the book is actually about his work with Jewish refugees. He wasn't actually very religious. His parents were Jewish. He was raised pretty agnostic, if not atheist. But he felt drawn to working, and he called Jews his co-religionists. So he felt probably more Jewish than the rest of his family, from what it seemed. And anyway, the first half of the book is a lot about that. Maybe not the first half, maybe the first third or something. A good portion, let's say. So when he was in Eastern Europe and Russia, very dangerous conditions. I mean, he was being shot at, he was hiding, his colleagues were killed, and he was a volunteer for most of that time. So some of the sources I used were the Hoover Presidential Museum, where I got that photo. Actually, it was online, but it's from there. The JDC archives, most of it was online, thankfully. So there were like hundreds of letters, so he was working for them in Eastern Europe and Russia. There were hundreds of letters between Henry and the directors in New York, cables, telegrams, all sorts of things. I also went to their library in New York City, and there was some more things. He wrote actually probably the best history of Jews in Eastern Europe that has never been published. And they have a very old copy there.
Who's the author of that?
Henry Alsberg.
He.
Yeah, it's not published. It was too long. It was like 1,000 pages. They were like, well, thanks, but we can't do this. But it had, it could be probably rewritten. I think they did have somebody do that. I went to the Center for Jewish History in New York City. That also helped me. I read like every article he wrote for The Nation. He wrote for The Forward and other Jewish newspapers. I read those. And there were other people who wrote books about the period and the places. So I read a lot of those. I did a lot of reading. I was so sick of nonfiction by the time this was done. I'm like, I only want to read novels now. So the context of... Do I need to go to the next one? No, I don't. Let me just check. Okay, sit. The context of this is 1920. So he was working sort of double duty as a Nation reporter and as a volunteer for the JDC. And at this point, he was trying to cross a river from Romania to Russia, partially to bring money that he had hidden in, his clothes to the people across the river who were starving and destitute, and partially because he was reporting and he wanted to see what was going on. Alsberg's goal was the town of Mohilev, which lay a mere 200 yards across the river and over the border in Russia. The wrecked bridge, its steel beams twisted from years of war, was half submerged in the icy river. The travelers had no choice but to cross in a small boat. The river currents and thunderous collisions with ice floes battered the vessel, threatening to capsize it and drown its occupants. Under the best of circumstances, January in Eastern Europe does not offer optimum travel conditions. For our travelers, 2 journalists, including Henry, and a soldier, the weather was the least of it. In 1920, the magnitude of destruction resulting from both World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution dominated the landscape. Turmoil and unrest with different political and military factions alternately controlling a city on any given day had rendered the region unstable and volatile. The area was much like that small boat given over to the vicissitudes of the river. With Henry Alsberg at the bow, the group bullied their way across the river. Alsberg felt relentlessly driven to cross into Russia. Waiting on the other side, as he wrote in his Nation dispatch, was reigning anarchy. But cross he did. Mohilev had undergone 20 harsh regime changes in just a few years. For the residents, this meant pillaging and terror, starvation and disease. For the Jewish population, pogroms accompanied the other horrors. Once in Mohilev, Alsberg made his first order of business the distribution of money entrusted to him by the JDC for the destitute and starving remaining residents. Murderous robber bands had just taken over the city. The local Jewish council convened to warn him that he was in danger. So dressed in Orthodox garb, he circumvented the robber bands and soldiers, taking refuge at the home of the poorest Jewish family in town. He hid there for 4 days, and as volleys of gunfire streaked the night sky, he finally went back and made his way across back to Romania. And then the second portion from this that I want to read, his first assignment for the JDC was to start an office in Czechoslovakia, which was a new country. So he was sent to Prague to start an office, and the office was there to support war orphans, Jewish refugees who They couldn't go back to their countries because of the new borders and all sorts of regulations. They weren't really allowed to stay where they were, so that they were in this limbo. So at some point they were living in, old army barracks in the middle of the winter. So millions were dying basically during this period. So he was in Czechoslovakia to help these people. After a certain period of time, he tried to get things under control, and he was transferred to an office in Poland. So this is about that transfer. The trip from Prague to Warsaw was 500 kilometers to the northeast and eons back in time to an almost medieval Europe. If Czechoslovakia was a bad dream, Poland was an unrelenting nightmare. He saw children sitting in a Warsaw gutter, begging for a piece of bread, quote, in a pitiful sing-song Yiddish, unquote, dressed in rags that couldn't begin to keep the cold away from their skeletal bodies. Typhus and tuberculosis were rampant. Massacres, pogroms, starvation, mutilation, disease. Reports and letters from Alsberg and others were peppered with unimaginable descriptions of suffering. Alsberg, never at a loss for words, fell to using the word indescribable more than once, lamenting that he'd already used whatever words he could conjure up. How many ways could one convey misery? So I'm moving up a few years to 1923 here. And this is just an example of how I use a number of different research pieces, puzzle pieces, for very short paragraphs, like one is 2 sentences. So he'd been traveling from Europe back and forth over the course of a bunch of years, and this ship manifest is from 1923, and it says that it landed at the port of New York. And when I looked up the ship and the shipping line, I saw that they actually landed in Hoboken, across the river. So I wondered, okay, well, you land in Hoboken and he lived in Manhattan. How do you get back? How do you get there? Just for some color, he landed, now he has to go back home. I called the Hoboken Museum. Very nice librarian was there, and he explained to me how a person would do this in 1923. There's also an article from the New York Times from that time period about Hoboken, what it was like then, not like what it is now. It's kind of funny. And so let me read this. This is Regaining His Land Legs, September 1923. Alsberg sailed from Rotterdam a few days after his 42nd birthday, his 4th transatlantic ocean voyage in 5 years. He disembarked from the Rundam at Hoboken, New Jersey's 5th Street Pier in early October, walking the 6 cobblestone blocks to the Lackawanna Terminal, over here, before taking the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad subway tube to Manhattan. So I always thought, they had subways then? What did I know? So for two sentences, I did a fair amount of research. Here's one more sentence, and this is about his last trip from Europe, and this was in the early 1930s. I always checked the weather whenever I saw it when he came home, just to see if there was anything interesting that I could add color. So this one had some interesting stuff. After a short stop in Germany, Alsberg boarded the steamship Bremen. His last transatlantic journey came to an end as the ship passed through a winter coastal storm that hit the eastern seaboard. Despite the high seas and heavy winds, the Bremen arrived on schedule on November 28th at Brooklyn's 58th Street Pier. So that was, it was like a fair amount of research for just a few short sentences. So I mentioned his time in the 1920s working with Emma Goldman, and also working with the International Political Prisoners Committee. That's Roger Baldwin, who was head of the ACLU and who co-founded it. Interestingly, when I was looking him up, I looked at books, I looked at articles, I looked at websites. One of the websites, I think it was, I won't say if it's history.com or History Channel, one of them had, the right information, but the wrong Roger Baldwin. And I'm looking, I'm like, I don't think that's what he looks like. And I called them, and they said, whoops, we have the wrong one, and they fixed it. So that's the real Roger Baldwin of the ACLU. So a lot of my research is methodical. I wanted to point that out, but sometimes things would just fall in my lap by accident, and you really have to be open, very open to that. So we're still in the 1920s. It would have, and really, the 1920s would have been enough for a book, honestly. He added another endeavor to his life, and that was working in theater, Provincetown Playhouse, and also at the neighborhood playhouse where he did The Divot. Provincetown Playhouse, he worked with E. Cummings, he worked with Eugene O'Neill, and he was a producer and a director. Director of the company, not of the plays. So the resources I used for this were the International Committee for Political Prisoners Archive, was at the New York Public Library. Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, as I mentioned before, they were deported from America to Russia. He had a diary, they had letters, and they were all online. There's a place in the Netherlands, and the diary's online, the letters between Henry and Emma Goldman, hundreds, I think, are online, and between Alexander Berkman and with other people that Emma wrote to, and Henry was in those letters because they were very close. I printed a whole bunch of them out just because, and I put them in chronological order because it was easier for me to just read it this way. They had pet names for each other. They were very, very close. She was really like a maternal figure to him. So I don't know if you want to see this, but these are the copies of the letters from mostly the 1920s, I'm thinking, if I remember right. I forgot a lot about what I did. So from these letters and from the diary, and then from both of their autobiographies, Berkman and Goldman, I learned a lot about Henry and his travels in Russia and in Eastern Europe, about his political leanings, about how he felt, which was very important, how he felt about what was going on. I read newspaper articles about the work he was involved in with Roger Baldwin and the Political Prisoners Committee. They were mostly concerned with the political prisoners in Russia. So when Lenin was there, and it wasn't so touchy-feely wonderful, they were throwing people in prison and just leaving them there. So it was basically becoming fascist. So they were kind of, even though they originally were all in favor of the Bolshevik government, they turned away from it because of what they saw. They still were liberal and socialist, but they were not in favor of the government that they saw in Russia. So I learned about all of that. I had to learn all about Bolshevik Russia. I looked at his archives, which included financial papers related to his theater and the Dybbuk. Billy Rose Theater Library in New York City, New York Public Library, has all the theater stuff that you need. And the history of both the Provincetown Theater and the Neighborhood Playhouse online in books. And the newspaper reviews of the plays that he wrote and the plays that he produced and things like that. I read the reviews. So, okay. Make sure I'm on the right page here. Don't want to get mixed up. Okay. So, and this, oops. This one I put this picture. This is Emma Goldman. This letter to Comrade Lenin from Emma Goldman. She wrote to Lenin when Henry was arrested by the Soviet secret police called the Cheka. They thought he was a spy. Actually, the FBI, the U.S. government thought he was a spy, spying, against the U.S. government. The Soviets thought he was a spy, so everybody was investigating him. And because he was just traveling all over the place, not always necessarily like having the right passport. He would just go, okay, there's a border, I don't care. So this is the letter she wrote to Lenin, trying to get him out of prison. He wasn't kept in prison like more than a couple of weeks, maybe not even. This is a book that I didn't bring it with me. It's in very fragile condition from 1924. He was in Europe a lot. He was in Paris a lot. So I used that book. I ordered it on Abe Books. It wasn't that expensive, and it's from 1924. And it's about Paris in that year. And, if you're writing about somebody being in a certain place, you want to know what it was like. So I used some of that information to help kind of give color to that.
Would that be considered like a guidebook?
It was a guidebook, yeah. It was called Baedeker, was the company, and they published guidebooks to Europe. Yeah, and actually the Baedeker guidebooks, they based, when he started the Writers Project, they kind of based their guidebooks on the Baedeker guidebooks. So I was going to bring that, but like I said, it's like kind of, it's very, very fragile. But you can see Carl Baedeker over here.
So you have your own copy?
I bought my own copy. I was just really interested because I kept reading about these Baedeker guidebooks, and I found it, and it wasn't terribly, it might have been like $50 or something ridiculous, or maybe even less. So I have a copy of that, yeah. So with Emma Goldman, they were very close. She kind of was like a maternal figure to him. And, there's a lot of letters, and they both had a very good sense of humor, and, you can see that in the letters, but he also suffered from depression. And a lot of his letters, he would be very open to her about that. So this is partially from one of those letters. The melancholy that began in Europe returned with a fierce grip when he arrived home in May 1925. Luckily for Alsberg, his ship landed in the bloom of spring and not during the throes of a cold, dim winter, certain to worsen his depression. By Decoration Day, now Memorial Day, he'd taken refuge in a shack that he'd built on his brother's land a few hours north of New York City in the picturesque hills east of the Hudson River. The little house in Putnam Valley had running water, a cellar, and an outside toilet hidden behind a rock outcropping. A coal stove warmed 2 rooms on chilly nights. But even this scenic, tranquil backdrop, so, quote, so beautiful that it made me ache, unquote, did not quell his ruminations, guilt about leaving his mother for so long, the yearning to be back in Paris, his own uncertain future, and life itself. So, as I researched Henry, I discovered that he was gay, and I wondered how he survived in the repressive times that he lived in. With some friends, he was able to be open about his sexuality. One of the reasons he was attracted to the anarchists was because that movement believed in sexual freedom. So letters between Henry and Emma Goldman and some other people made it clear that they were aware and accepting of his sexual orientation. There was a close friend from his childhood who worked with him at the Provincetown Playhouse, and I found her nephew, and he knew him very well, and we became kind of friendly. And he told me that they were very close to Henry and his family, and he said, yeah, he was gay, we all knew it, it didn't matter, we didn't care. You know, it just wasn't a big deal. They were very progressive people. It was a matter of fact, and it didn't matter to them. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It wasn't totally true with others. This is an FBI from an FBI file. It's a little bit later. As I said, they were investigating him from the 20s. In the 20s, when he was in Europe, thought he was a spy. Then they said, okay, you're not a spy, you're a journalist. And then when he worked for the WPA, I think, well, I'll talk about how it closed down and how he was fired. I think part of it was because he was gay, though there's no real proof. But this is proof that he was fired from a later government job because he was gay. And, you know, he engaged in an immoral relationship. And I didn't put the other man's name here, just because privacy issues. So I used the FBI files. Hard to get. I filed Freedom of Information Act. They wrote me back and they said, yeah, well, we might be able to get this in 3 years or so. Like, yeah, well, I can't wait 3 years. And I appealed it. And they have like a certain forms you have to fill out to appeal it, and you have to, like, you know, say why you need it, why it's in the national interest, you know, all this other stuff. So I appealed it twice, and then I called my congressman's office, and they got it for me within about 3 months. So it was in time, so I was able to use this. So that was good. So I used the FBI stuff. So this is interesting. I meant to get one. Victoria took these pictures. And I meant to get one of the others. This is the stone wall, and you can't, I used the wrong one. You can tell. The stone wall Inn is here. He lived right next door at Christopher Street in the 1940s. It was called Bonnie's Stone Wall in the 1940s. He lived there then, and then later on he moved. So meaning Victoria, took those pictures. So that's a stone wall. I can't really, it's kind of little, and that was his apartment. Right across the street on Christopher Street where these are these statues representing, you know, commemorating Stonewall events and representing 2 gay couples. So the interesting part that I found out later was there's only 2 places in the world that these statues exist: across the street from his old apartment, and in the city where he died, Palo Alto, California. So he moved when he was older, and those are the only 2 places that these statues exist. So I think that was kind of interesting. The other things I used. There was a diary written by a man who also worked for the government. He was gay, and he worked for the government at the same exact time that Henry did. And he wrote a diary. And after he died, his niece, he had given her permission. She published it, and it was about working for the government in the 1930s, and how repressive it was just in general, life in general, not just working for the government, but life in general. So I kind of used that a little bit. The letters, as I mentioned. This is cool. There's letters to and from a friend who was gay, but I don't think they were lovers. I think they were friends. But this friend had a relationship, a very serious relationship, with Senator Cutting of New Mexico. And this is the son of the Cuttings from the Bayard Cutting Arboretum. So one of the sons moved to New Mexico, became a senator, and it was pretty clear that they had this relationship. They don't tell you that on the tour. Yeah, so anyway, those are the... I'm going to read this one passage. This is kind of skipping ahead. This is the last chapter before the epilogue, and it talks about his late life writings. He wrote about some of the problems he had, being gay in the world that he lived in then. He was 75 years old when he wrote these. He had already lived in Palo Alto by then. He moved in with his sister who lived there. And he spent a lot of time in Mexico. He didn't go back to Europe again. So this is about the writings. He still yearned to work on his own fiction, and indeed composed around 100,000 words worth of stories. Unfortunately, he told a friend, I haven't even tried to market any of it. Subject matter not such as permits publication, I fear. He was referring to his Mexican stories. That's what he titled them. A set of tales he wrote in Cuernavaca that gave free rein to his reveries about romantic and sexual love between men and his longing for a social climate that accepted homosexuality. One story depicted an Aztec warrior who wept at his inability to feel attracted to women and his subsequent loneliness because his heart's desire, quote, could not be fulfilled with transgressing the laws of the gods and man, unquote. A more contemporary story told of a young anthropology professor forced to act in a conventional manner to keep his job. Quote, this is from his story, for diversion he went to New York, had his usual luck, beatings up and a spot of blackmail now and then. Unquote. Alsberg knew enough that the stories would be considered obscene and illegal at the time. It's telling that he signed them as Henry Garfield. He didn't use his full name. So I'm finally going to get into the WPA, which is about 4 chapters of the book. Everything he did led up to the WPA years. So, when most people think of the WPA, they think of the construction, the public works, the bridges, the schools, things like that. But another project was called Federal One, and that consisted of art projects, theater, art, music, and the writing projects. And that was from 1935 to 39 was the actual Federal Writers Project. They lasted a few years later after he was fired, but as smaller state projects, so I kind of don't count it. So over the short time of its existence, about 10,000 people were employed, not all at the same time. Most of them were off of welfare rolls, relief rolls. They were unemployed, they needed money. They weren't all writers, some were researchers, some librarians, secretaries, support staff, so on. Among the writers who were famous or who would become famous were Saul Bellow, Richard Wright, John Cheever, Zora Neale Hurston, which is over there. She happens to be over there. And each guide contained chapters on history, natural resources, travel route descriptions, geography, photos, maps, essays about the people living in the States. And this included immigrants, Native Americans, and African Americans. And this part was unprecedented. He battled fiercely with some of the directors in the southern states. He didn't get to appoint everybody. Sometimes the political machines appointed the director of the program. He mostly was able to appoint them, but not always. And he appointed a lot of women, which, the percentage was really high for the day. Anyway, so he was always fighting with some of the southern directors about what to include, and they didn't want to include the African Americans. They're constantly being reprinted, even though the first ones came out, I think, in 1937 or 38. Over the years, they're always reprinted. There's usually a foreword to it that explains what it is. And this is one that was reprinted, I can't remember, just maybe in the last 10 years, about New York City. New York City had a very, very vibrant unit, and it did include Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison and so many other people. So I looked at the American guidebooks, the tour books. That's just one of them. Many of them are online. Some are in the libraries. Some I just got from Abe Books. It was easier because I couldn't find them. I compared the newer ones and the older ones. When they rewrote the Washington Guide, there was a part in the Washington Guide written by an African-American poet named Sterling Brown. And he wrote about basically the terrible conditions that the African Americans lived in Washington at that time. When they rewrote the book after Henry was fired, they made it totally different. They changed it, and it was not the same kind of book. So I looked at those books. I went to the Library of Congress. I went to the National Archives. I looked at their WPA and their Writers Project collections. I found memos, letters, photographs, portions of book that were begun but never finished because the project was shut down. Multitudes of articles about the Writers Project from them, including editorials for and against. They thought they were a bunch of slackers, basically. So I will read a quick excerpt about his beginning year there. That's Henry with his secretary. That's Orville Hurston. Okay. The experiences Alsberg brought with him made him singularly prepared to navigate between the bohemian world of writers, the bureaucracy of Washington insiders, the jumble and jungle of state political machines, and the dignified societal airs of the White House. By then, Alsberg needed a place to vent his pent-up ideology. He was a rebel who needed another cause. In 1935, all of his paths converged in glorious synthesis, merging his obsessions with social justice, writing, and politics under the Writers' Project canopy. He devoted himself like never before, immersing body and soul into this adventure. He did not flounder. For a brief, glorious time at age 54, his skills and experiences found a suitable American home. So out of the goals to celebrate cultural and ethnic diversity came these other projects: ex-slave narratives, life history, and folklore projects. This is one of the ex-slave narratives that was collected and photographed. Now these were former slaves who were in their 80s, maybe even 90s, remembering their childhood in slavery or remembering the stories that their parents and grandparents told them. So it's really first-hand information. This is a life history, that's what they called it, story from a worker at a meatpacking plant. A lot of them are on the American Memory website on the Library of Congress, so if you want to look at them. Others are scattered around the country in different archives. When I first started looking, I went to the New York City Municipal Archives because they had a lot of stuff. They had it on microfilm at the time, and it was like falling apart. And just like last week, I looked, and they were preparing a book. It wasn't finished, called the Spanish Book, and it was basically oral histories of Spanish-speaking immigrants in New York City. So this is the Spanish Book Project website where they started. It's been, I don't know if it's fully digitized yet, but at least it's partially digitized. And like 5 years ago, it wasn't. So I did go there. There was a book in Italian about Italian immigrants and in English about Italian immigrants in New York City. Like I said, the New York City Writers Project was very prolific. There was a book in Yiddish about Jewish immigrants in New York City too. So a lot of stuff, when the project was shut down, which I'm about to get to, a lot of the things that they collected was just kind of left, and they never finished. They meant for all of it to be in books, and not everything was. Actually, this one, Benjamin Botkin worked for the Writers Project. He was a folklorist, and he put together, this is a newer version, called The American Classic, Lay My Burden Down, and it's folk history of slavery, so it has some of the things from that era that he collected. He saved the stuff. They brought it to the Library of Congress to save it, and then he worked at the Library of Congress to kind of collect it and put it together. So this is a newer version, but it came out, I think, in 1941 or 42 or 43, something like that. But he worked on that one, and he was an important part of that. Did I want to read something? No. Okay. So, despite positive reviews from book critics and support from academic institutions, success in the marketplace, the Writers Project was under attack mostly from the House Committee on American Activities, and that would be UAC, as we know it. They were formed to look into Nazism, fascism, communism on American soil, but they just focused really on the Theater Project and on the Writers Project. They were its targets. So that's Henry testifying at the UAC hearings. And that was probably the most important source for me for those chapters, those hearings. And there were other hearings too, where either he testified or people testified against him, saying all these horrible things that weren't true. So when they were shut down, when the art projects were shut down in 1939, my focus, of course, was on Henry. What happened? How did he feel about it? Some of the information I found was fuzzy. Did he get fired? Did he quit? So I had to weave together, again, dozens of sources to find out what happened. And besides the transcripts, the hearing transcripts themselves, Smithsonian Institute did interviews with WPA people in the 1960s, and that's one of them. They talked about how FBI was constantly hounding him. He actually, there's a story about him when he was in his 70s, they were bothering him again about something, and he actually threatened to throw the FBI guy down the stairs in I think it was in Christopher Street, or someplace near there. His own memos at the Library of Congress and at National Archives showed that even when he was fired, he didn't quit. When he was fired, he wouldn't leave. Not right away. He wanted to finish, there were a whole bunch of books on the presses, all sorts of, the state books. They were on the presses, and he was trying to get them out before, they physically made him leave. So he just didn't leave right away. So that's Martin Dies, very media-savvy man who was, trying to make his mark. He was the chair of UAC. So this is before McCarthy, that was in the 50s. This was in the 30s. This was the first UAC. And he, like I said, very media savvy, and he was out to get them, and he kind of won. Oh, that was, you saw the first page of the hearings. So primary source materials are held in archives, in government institution, libraries, museums, all over the place, universities. Archive Grid is where I did a lot of my looking. It's a website. You can type in a person's name or a topic even, and it will show you where there are a lot of documents. I would put his name at the top. I don't know if you can see that. And I think it said 114 hits. Sometimes it would say 110, sometimes it would say 114. It wasn't always the same. I think I must have looked at all of them. Because I never knew. But, you can't always tell how important it's going to be. So, and because he was involved in so many things, I couldn't go to just one archive. I went to probably a dozen. And then you can order documents from others. So it saved time. I had to spend money, but I ordered a lot of documents that I needed. And some archives were easier to use than others. They all had different rules. Some you always want to make an arrangement before you go with whoever the archivist is. They have guidelines on their websites. You can't bring personal things into the reading rooms or the rooms where you're doing the research. They have lockers like outside, or sometimes like in the basement or something. Be as organized as you can before you go. I started learning this the first time I went. I was like, ugh, I don't know what to do. That'll look great on tape. But you want to be as organized as you can. They had lockers. I learned to bring granola bars with me because that would be like suddenly it'd be 1 o'clock. I've been working for 4 hours and I'm starving and I don't really want to stop because they close at 4. And but I don't want to go out and get food, so I would go to my locker, munch a couple of granola bars, and go back. So sometimes you could bring laptops, sometimes you couldn't. You can almost always bring a cell phone to take pictures. I don't think anybody didn't let me do that. Some places where like Library of Congress, once there's a lot of security and papers to fill out and stuff like that. But once you were in, you were in. So you could roam around, go to the photograph room division, go to the motor vehicle, the motion picture. You can go to all different places. The great cafeteria, really a great. I'm not kidding. So that's the reading room. So it was easy to use. This is the finding aids for the Federal Writers Project. So you want to look at the finding aids. They're usually online, not always. You want to look at them before you go, and you want to look through more than you think you'll need. And you waste a lot of time looking at stuff that you're not going to really care about, that won't help. But then you also find things that you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. So that's one of the finding aids. And I know I'm trying to talk fast now because it's getting late, but it should be time for a couple of questions. This is a national. Oops. This is the National Archives.
Just a question about the finding aids. I noticed that they have folders listed.
Yeah,
it doesn't always describe everything.
No. Sometimes some finding aids are better than others, but none of them are really wonderfully descriptive. So that's why you really have to look at stuff. So I found stuff like when I went to his archive in Oregon, the finding aid was very. It wasn't very descriptive. So I just found stuff that wasn't even listed in the finding aid. Wasn't even the folder wasn't even in the finding aid. This is National Archives in Maryland. This is the kind of the main reading room. Those are pictures of declassified files. I have this I had a sound which I forgot to put on the computer, but it was, I think some of you saw it, boom, 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 from Jaws, you know. It was a hard place to use, and that's why the bloody title there. Just because they had, and of course they have to have security, then National Archives, but it was like you register when you go. I mean, you know, it's like heavy duty security. And then if you want to move from that room to another room, you have to go through this basically airport security level line again just to get to where they have the photos. And then, you know, so it took so long to work there. Plus, you know, you can only take one folder out at a time, usually. Most places, if you took two out, they didn't really, they're not staring at you. They had cameras. Those lights were cameras up there. So if I took two folders out, suddenly I was surrounded by, you know, a group of security guys, and I'm like, what did I do? And, oh, you can only take one folder out. Okay, sorry. So, you know, it was just a tough place to work. And this is just the call slip that, I could talk more about it, but it's a call slip at the National Archives. Some special problems. Some things are only available. Whoa, what happened? Ah. Whoops, I went too far. Okay. Some things are only available on microfilm. I borrowed reels from Interlibrary Loan from Yale and Smithsonian, but I had to find a working microfilm machine on Long Island. It was not that easy. It really was not that easy. Another problem is, the deeper I went into researching certain events, the more I found that there were different versions of the truth. The international political prisoners story is an example. I was pretty sure that Henry started it in the United States. You know, in contact with other people, Emma Goldman in Europe, but I was pretty sure he started it here, but I was reading books that said he didn't. And I was like, but I'm sure from some of the letters, it seems like he was the one who initiated it. So I did go to that archive in the city that I told you about, the International Political Prisoners, and I found that he and, you know, the letters that he and Roger Baldwin had back and forth showed that it was Henry's initiation, that it started it. And Roger Baldwin was brought in because he had a name and he was with the ACLU, though he couldn't do it through the ACLU, but he started it, but it didn't say that in most books. So the first book that said he didn't start it, or that said somebody else started it, that's what people quoted. So the rest of the books after that were all wrong. So, you know, I'm trying to change it, but, you know, unless they quote me, they're not going to know. So all of these books have the wrong information. And, you know, we always tell students, well, you know, books are right and Wikipedia is wrong. And that's not always true. So, you know, not that I'm recommending we use Wikipedia, but this is his archive, one box in Oregon, University of Oregon at Eugene. That was a tree on the campus. Imagine having a redwood tree, a sequoia, on our campus. It was beautiful to sit under when I got exhausted. His box, now, okay, so he has an archive. It's one box. It was not in archive grid. How did I find it? Totally by accident. I was reading letters between his friends when he died. They were, you know, oh God, Henry died, it's terrible. One of them wrote, I hear his papers went to the University of Oregon. So I was like, oh, let's check. So I called, and yeah, it was true. But it wasn't, I don't even remember if it was on their website at the time. But it wasn't an archive grid. So once I found out, they mailed me the finding aid because it wasn't online. So that was kind of interesting. And I found, well, it was really fun looking through there. I used a lot of print sources. Actually, kind of Google Books were helpful. I found out through Google Books that his play, The Dybbuk, would have been Gershwin's first full-length opera. Porgy and Bess was, but it would have been The Dybbuk. They had signed the contracts. They were all set to do it with the Metropolitan Opera House. But then the stock market crash came and some other things happened, and it fell through. So, kind of interesting. The Internet Archive is where I found the UAC hearings and other government documents, and I found some newsreels about the WPA. So I found 2 or 3, and that was kind of fun to watch. I use newspapers, of course, you know, some from our databases, some that are just regular websites. This is an article he wrote, I think it's in 1918, I found on this Fulton history website. It's a great website because it has a lot of stuff. It's very difficult to use. It's a really hard interface. Kevin's smiling, he knows.
Just some way of seeing it.
Yeah, and it has tons of stuff. It's unbelievable, but man, going through that, it was hard. I used obituaries a lot. It was very helpful. He was distantly related, Henry, to this guy, former counsel to the ACLU. So I did his obituary in the New York Times. Thank goodness these relatives were famous. And I looked up his children, who had also, then when they died, their obituaries, and I found that this guy's grandchildren. And so they knew Henry because extended family. And I was able to get a photo. The reason I was trying to call them is I was having trouble finding photos of Henry. So I didn't actually use the photo that I got, but I was able to get a family photo. So obituaries are really helpful to follow people, to stalk people, to stalk dead people. If you want to publish, the worst part was gathering the permissions, the licensing agreements, and those are for interviews, photographs, and other documents. It was not fun. I could do another hour on this topic. This is the licensing agreement I paid to New York Public Library to use a photo of the Dybbuk production. It was taken after 1923, so that's like the magic. 1923, if it was before that, it would be in public domain, it would be much easier. It was after 1923. However, luckily they owned the rights to it, which is another portion of it. It's not just public domain, it's who owns, well, after 1923, it's who owns the rights. They own the rights, so I didn't have to figure out who owned the rights. So I paid them for the picture. They gave me a high quality scan, and it was $100. And I also paid them the licensing fee so I could use that photo. And they get credit in the book, of course, but and the top photo is one of Henry's, probably his best friend, and his wife painted that watercolor, and she gave me permission to use it. So I use a lot of genealogical resources. I'm happy to give these to you, send an email or something. These are some of them. They're very helpful. These are more ethnic heritage resources. Again, I'm happy to send them to you. And then for this final slide, to wrap it up, tracing a person's life, giving context to it. It's all complicated, and I thought I would lose my mind at times, and I was ready to quit, but I didn't. But ultimately, it was rewarding. So I hope this has been useful, and I want to end by telling you about the final days of Henry's life. And the puzzle pieces I used for that were the newspaper obituaries about him. That's one of them from the New York Times. Letters from his friends to his surviving siblings, and letters his friends wrote to one another about him. So I'm just going to read a little part. No, God, I got hurt. And this picture here, that's his cousin. Her name is Elizabeth. They never met. She came from the same town in Germany her family came from the same town in Germany that he came from. They were cousins. She came after the war. She was a Holocaust survivor. And it was complicated how I found her. But they were second or third cousins. We were kind of trying to figure that out. She told me all about the town where the family came from, so that was interesting. She lived in Manhattan. I went to her apartment. We had a really nice night together, evening together. We had crackers and cheese and Riesling together. It was adorable. Unfortunately, she passed away about maybe 2 months before the book came out, so that was sort of sad. It was very sad, actually. Okay, so this is the last part I'll read. Alsberg might have been surprised at the attention paid to his death through national newspaper obituaries, although not particularly enthused about all of it. The New York Times and Washington Post both gave coverage, and with the former concentrating on the communist controversy swirling around Alsberg and the Writers' Project, and the latter giving his Writers' Project work a more positive spin. Letters of condolence to Julius and Elsa, his siblings, conveyed more personal sorrows. His former secretary, that's her, told Elsa, his sister, that she would miss, quote, Henry's guiding spirit. An old colleague wrote, Henry was such a humane being who belongs to a vanishing, if not vanished, race and age, and the few who knew him who are still around will be lonelier than ever without him. Another friend wrote, Henry's spirit goes on in many ways, including the American Guide series, which was perhaps his greatest contribution to America. And then the last paragraph, before the epilogue, is this. Again, one is reminded of the Federal Writers' Project's preservation of the life stories of thousands of people who otherwise would have faded into oblivion. This same transmigratory circle includes the Dybbuk, with its permeable wall allowing ethereal slippings from death to life and back again. In a foreword to a Dybbuk production in 1928, Henry Alsberg wrote about these tenuous connections. Quote, "The living are the unreal entities, the dead hovering all about us are the real beings." So that's my presentation. Thank you for coming. I'm very proud to be back here again. And if you have any questions, I know it's kind of running late, but...
Have you written your Wikipedia article yet?
You know, it's on my list. In the very beginning, I fixed some things on a Wikipedia article that were wrong. And then after all this was over, I was going to rewrite, yeah, I haven't. I have a lot of things to... I started a website, I didn't finish it. Yeah, I have a list of things to do. Work, Yes.
I'm afraid I have to leave soon.
Oh, good.
How it sounds from your lecture, you had this overabundance of material.
Oh.
Like, how did you make choices?
Oh my
Like,
God, it was very
how
hard.
did you lay a line that kind of now makes up a narrative, I guess? I haven't read the book.
Yeah,
but,
it was torturous. And I did actually change, because in the 1920s he did everything at the same time. I mean, he would be walking from his newspaper office to the theater to the JDC office in a day. He was doing all the same thing. So I was like, well, how do I do this?
But what were your criteria for leaving out stuff and taking it in? You must have had some overall.
It was like a case by case.
Life, no?
It was a case by case basis, and I try to give the best, not the best okay, you're so great, because somebody who, I had a couple of readers, and one of them said, you're too in love with him. You have to show his flaws. So that was important. So I wanted to give a balance of his life. And yeah, there was a lot I left out. It was really case by case. And I didn't have this overarching I just wanted to give the right, an accurate picture, the best accurate picture I could possibly give, if that makes any... It was hard. I mean, still I think, even for doing this, I'm like, what do I put in?
So you were more guided by the material then, not beforehand. You had not a plan before.
No, I mean, I didn't even know he did half the stuff when I started. And that's when I'm like, oh crap, now I have to write about whatever it was. There would be times oh shit, really? You did that too? Come on, you're killing me here. I can't, now I have to research this and understand it and, whatever. It was just it was very hard. It was hard to choose. Yeah.
This is related to Gertrude's question, because having to do with truth. Because you were saying that sometimes you'll get several versions of the same thing, and you don't know whether it's completely true, half true, stretching the truth, or a lie.
Right.
So, what do you do in that case?
Well, if you read, say whatever topic is, you read 10 books about it, or 10, I didn't read the whole books, but portions of the books, and I see those that they don't all agree. Sometimes they all agreed and it was fine. So if 10 books agree about it, it's probably, that's how it happened. But with the international political prisoners, I'm reading all different versions, and that's when I said, well, I'll just go to the source. Luckily, it was in New York City, and that was the archive there, and they had all the original letters, all the documents, all the meeting, the meeting minutes. So I read the minutes of the meetings, and okay, Henry Alsberg wants to start this thing. And he was working with Emma Goldman too, because she was doing it in Europe.
So you had to go back to some primary source.
You go to the primary source, yeah. You have to go to the
problem was with the secondary and tertiary sources.
Yeah, really. And some of these people, they wrote these books. They heard, they mostly they just quoted another book. So the first, I forgot which was the first. One of the first books that said it. Tons of people quoted this book, and I'm like, well, no, that's not what I read. So I would check it out. Yeah. So, and it would be a pain in the ass, too.
Yeah.
Yes?
You never did say what interested you in the first place in this relatively obscure person.
I will tell you what interested me. I was at the reference desk here when I worked here, and Steve Schreier asked me to look up some stuff on Jackie Robinson. And I found stuff on the Library of Congress website. And as I was kind of tooling around the Library of Congress website, I came across the Federal Writers Project, which I had never heard of. This was 10 years ago, 12 years ago, whatever. And I'm like, hey, this is really cool. And they had these life histories. And I was so I got interested in the Writers Project. So I was very involved in that. And I wrote, articles and a couple of plays about that. And then after a while, it was like, he seems pretty interesting. Some of the things say he went to Europe, he went to Russia, and he was a spy, and he was fighting off people, and he was friends with Emma Goldman. So, I would start slowly, not thinking I was going to write a book, reading more about him. And what happened was, I looked for a biography about him. Because I said, there must be a biography, I'm interested in him, and there wasn't. And I'm like, well, that's stupid. There should be a biography of him. And I'm like, well, maybe I should write it. And I'm like, well, I've never written a book. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe I'll just think about it. And it wasn't like, yes, I'm definitely doing it. I would do it slowly. I would start doing some research. When I was in California, I happened to be in his town where he lived the last few years. I went to the public library. I found in a vertical file, I don't even know if we have those anymore, they had the obituaries, and they had a speech that somebody gave at his sister. Was it his funeral or his sister's funeral? And it was by this woman, it was her eulogy. And it was in this vertical file. Because his sister in Palo Alto did all this social justice stuff. She was, she worked for Japanese immigrants and people who were put in camps in California. So she was also a social justice hero, I guess, of her own in California. So it was really about her, but I found a eulogy, but one of her friends wrote it about her. And I said, let me look in the phone book. This woman was alive. She was in the phone book. I called her up. She said, oh, yeah, I knew Henry. I'm like, oh, my God. I'm in Palo Alto staying at, like, some crappy motel. And I said, can I come meet you? And she said, of course. And I went to meet her, and she's another person who told me about his archive in Oregon. By then I sort of knew, but she said, yeah, I'm the one who put the box on the bus to send it to Oregon. So, it really started out at that reference desk with Jackie Robinson.
And when you met people like her, did you actually record them?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I did.
And you asked permission?
I had to get permission to quote them, yeah, so I quoted, there were really a bunch of old ladies, they're all like in their 90s, but they knew him. They were young women at the time when they knew him. They were all, like the guy's photo who I showed, the watercolor, his wife, actually she just sent me a really nice letter the other day. So she met him when she was very young. She's an artist. This other woman was also, she was a writer, the one in Palo Alto. And her father worked with Henry on the New York Evening Post like back in the 20s. So they were all very educated, very bright, on top women. They were just like, they were wonderful, and they were like supportive once, especially after I sent them the book, and then they were like, hey, you really did it. So, yeah.
Did you use anything to keep track of your citations? Were you, like, the rights?
Wait, the citation or the rights?
Well, both. I mean, you obviously used hundreds of sources, but...
I'm probably not as well as I should have. After I started writing, yeah, I had like separate files where I was putting citations, but I really was as bad a student sometimes, I swear to God. But I did, that's why I ordered so many books. I'm like, I have to keep this book on the shelf. So I would write quick notes, the 1929 book about the Providence Temple House, whatever, the red book. No. I didn't keep the best notes ever. So when it came to do the citations, it took a really long time. I mean, I kept notes throughout. But for the licenses and stuff like that, yeah, I had to be careful with. Like, I went through the manuscript, I saw who I quoted, I made sure I contacted them way ahead of time, sent them the letter that the publisher, told me to send, and got all the permissions. I don't think anybody denied permission. University of Oregon didn't understand what I was talking about when I asked. Permissions about letters and archives are a whole different story. Even if it's written before 1923, even if it's in a university, it could be owned by, like, Henry's niece. She died. But it could be owned by his nephew, who is 100 years old, and I think he's alive. And he didn't answer any of my phone calls, any of my letters, and I think he is still alive. And now I don't even want to contact him. If he didn't answer me, maybe there was a reason.
You need permission to quote his letter.
Well, nobody knows who actually owns the letters themselves in archives. Some places do, like there's one place where you could look up, you could put in a name.
Well, whoever owns the letters isn't as important as the copyright is the person who wrote the letter. In other words...
No, the person who wrote the letter, but everybody I was quoting was dead. So they might have passed on all
So
of
then the
their,
estate,
they passed it on to the estate, possibly.
Especially the estate permission to.
Right, and
hold
you
that.
can't, and like University of Oregon had no idea who, you know.
Some archives will actually, that's.
I had to sign for every archive, I had to sign a license, an agreement that said, I know, you know, you don't own the copyright and I'm using them anyway. And what I did was I checked with every person I knew who was a writer, a biographer, and they said, it's fair use, don't worry about it. And that's the cause everybody, because nobody knows. And, you know, hopefully I won't get sued, you know? But it was a pain in the neck.
Now, when it came to getting permissions, you were suggesting that sometimes there were fees that you had to pay.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
Just for the photographs.
oh, just for the photographs.
Yes.
Well, okay, but
Oh, okay, we have to cut off.
I'm just wondering if the publisher was willing to pay some of those fees.
No, they were not.